I'm Richard Bentley, this is Bodmin Road Church, and this is the second of three little talks looking at the question of suffering, the problem of evil, and how can you believe in God when there is so much evil in our world. Quick summary: in part one, we actually analysed that question and we saw that there was something of a contradiction in it. To say, how can you believe in God when there's so much evil, doesn't really work as an argument, because for there to be evil, how do you define evil? Evil requires there to be a difference between good and bad. It requires there to be a moral law to the universe, and that requires there to be a God. If there is no God, then there can be no definition of evil, and evil shouldn't actually be a problem to us. It shouldn't trouble us. But it does trouble us. So if you want to be a pure and absolute atheist in that respect, you've not only got to reject the idea of God, you've got to reject the idea of evil too. And indeed Dawkins goes that far. He does that in one statement in one of his books. But what you can't do is say there's lots of evil in the world, therefore there is no God. That argument doesn't hold up. That's sort of what we looked at last time. What I want to do this time is say, well, okay, we've still got a problem, because what the Christian view is saying, what the Bible view is saying, is that there is evil in the world, it is very real, and that there is a God. And I accept that is, at first sight, a difficult set of things to put together. In fact, it's helpful to look at it this way. There are three statements that summarise the sort of Christian view, which on their own each might sound fine, but it's when we put them together that we sort of encounter this problem. The first sort of statement is that God is good, that God is love, that God is good and all loving. The second bit of Christian theology, or of worldview if you like, is that God is all powerful. Surely that's what God is. And the third plank, the third statement that we're dealing with in this logical conundrum, is that evil and suffering are real. Now you take any one of those on your own, on its own, and you probably it's not too bad. God is love, yep. God's powerful, yep. Evil's real, yep. But it's when you try and put those three things together and hold them together that they just don't sit together. You've got to sort of throw one statement out, because surely if God is all loving, then he would want to eliminate suffering. And if he's all powerful, then he would be able to eliminate suffering. But suffering still exists. So there's a contradiction there. Why, if he wants to eliminate it, and he can eliminate it, why hasn't he? You just can't fit those three statements together. Something has got to give. And of course the standard atheist answer is to, in a sense, remove both of the first two statements, remove God altogether. And I accept that removes the logical difficulty of understanding how God and evil can coexist in the universe. We remove God, that problem goes. So that's the atheist solution. As I say, if you want to do it in a pure way, you've got to really say there's no evil either. But anyway, the Buddhist answer is to question statement 3, the reality of evil and suffering. In very broad terms, the Buddhist answer is that no, they aren't real and they aren't bad. It's just about our perceptions. And now that might sound quite a nice theory and a nice way of looking at things, until perhaps someone murders your child or something like that, and then I'm really not sure that approach works. I don't think we can deny evil. We can deny suffering. And the Bible certainly doesn't attempt to. That is not a Christian solution to play it down. Evil is there and it is bad. So I think we've got statement 3, absolutely. We're going to have to say, yeah, this is real. Evil is real. So we're going to have to look at statement 1 or statement 2. Something's going to have to give, because these three just don't fit together. So some Christians sort of sort the problem out by trying to modify statement 1 and redefine what we might mean by love and by goodness. And they might say something like this, that, you know what, well, God does things that might not look like love and might not look good. They might look bad to us, but they are loving and good in the long run. That everything turns out that God does to be loving and good in the long run. He knows best. His will is perfect, and who are we to question whether something is loving or good? I mean, to that answer, I have to say, try telling that to somebody in a death camp. Moreover, there's an issue of language here. If the Bible chooses to use words like love and good to define God, then surely we have to assume that the Bible is choosing those words on the basis that we do know pretty well what they mean. And they don't include things like Auschwitz. So I cannot go down that route of in a sense, blunting God's love or redefining God's goodness to say, well, actually, you're almost saying it's okay for God to do bad things. I can't find that solution. So I'm holding on to statement 3, that evil exists. I'm holding on to statement 1, absolutely, that God is love and that God is good. That leaves us only with one option left, and that is to try and redefine statement 2. And I think that's where the answer is. I think that's where the answer lies. That the fundamental answer to the problem of suffering, and I can't unpack this in all its detail today, there's lots of detail, lots of elements to this. I'm just trying to give us a broad general nudge in the right direction. But the broad answer to suffering is to look again at statement 2. God is all-powerful. And we need to learn to think about that in a grown-up way. Because I think far too many Christians think that it means God can do whatever he likes. And actually that's naive. And it's not what the Bible teaches. God grieves. God weeps over the suffering that is in this world. But he is not in a position, just at the click of his fingers, to remove it or to stop it. In fact, there are all sorts of things that it is not possible for God to do. There are some things that it is not logically possible for God to do. God cannot make a square circle. There are some things that it is not morally possible for God to do. For example, if God were playing you at Monopoly, God cannot win the game by supernaturally influencing the roll of the dice. Because that's called cheating. And God cannot cheat. He might have the power to influence the roll of the dice so that you land on his square with a hotel on Mayfair, but that would be cheating. God is not a God who cheats. He's not a God who breaks the rules. God's power, in other words, has some limits around it. It has some logical limits around it. It has some moral limits around it. C.S. Lewis argues that the only way to create a meaningful, any sort of meaningful creation, you have to allow both free process and free will. Free process to the laws of physics and chemistry and biology and chance and randomness. You have to allow some free process. And you have to allow free will to the beings that you create. Because without free will, there is no meaning. There could be no such thing as love. Love has to be freely chosen. And love can also be rejected and pushed away. A perfect world would have to be a robotic world. And God didn't want to make a robotic world. In fact, that issue is really cleverly explored in the film I, Robot. If you've not watched it, go and watch it. It's an old film, but go and watch I, Robot. It really explores those issues. A perfect world would have to be a robotic world. God had no interest in making a robotic world and robotic creatures. God wanted to make a world in which love and relationship were freely chosen. A world in which love for him and love for others were freely chosen. But that sort of a world that's got free process in it and free will in it unavoidably includes the possibility of evil and unavoidably includes the possibility of suffering. Because creatures can use their free will either to love and be good or to do terrible things. So we live in a creation where free will and free process are part of the structure, they're part of the rules, they're part of the way that God has made things. And they introduce the possibility of suffering. And so now with our corrupted free will, mankind can choose to use steel not just to make buildings, but to make bullets. And what do we want? A God who randomly intervenes in our world, left, right and centre, to turn every bullet into plasticine. That would be a nonsense world. An impossible world to live in if God intervened at every moment to overrule our bad decisions. That would remove human responsibility. If we want freedom and true meaning and significance for the creatures and for the whole of creation, then you have to allow free will and free process. And that creates the possibility for suffering to enter. And once God has created in that way, and it seems to me that was the only way to create, he cannot then keep randomly intervening left, right and centre to fix stuff. In other words, there are limits around God's use of his power, which are set by the very nature of God's character and by the rules, the very nature of the creation in which we live. It's in the heart of that discussion that I think is to be found the answer to suffering. I've not answered every single circumstance or every aspect of it. I realise that. I've not gone into a whole load of details and questions. I'm trying to paint with broad brushstrokes. And I'm trying to suggest that the Christian answer is that yes, God is real and he is good and he is loving. Statement one is not something we can twist out of shape. And yes, evil is real and bad and suffering. We can't just dismiss evil as something to do with our perceptions. But it's in a reanalysis of that second statement where the answer is to be found as to why we live in a world where evil and God, for the moment at least, coexist. I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to recommend two books to you. It's a classic, it's an old book now, but it's a classic. This is C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain. If you've not read that, it's well worth reading. Wherever you're coming from, whether you're a Christian, an atheist, somebody just trying to get your head around this without, an agnostic, you're not sure either way, The Problem of Pain is really helpful. Lewis is a smart chap, Oxford professor, of literature actually, but an excellent lay theologian and very, very helpful book. And I'd also recommend, if you would call yourself a Christian and you've attempted to pray and sometimes you've wondered, where is God and why aren't my prayers answered, and all around that issue of suffering, this book, God on Mute, really explores in depth and in very helpful ways many of the things I've just been talking about, and unpacks them further and looks at prayer and why sometimes our prayers aren't answered and we do suffer pain and loss and all those things. God on Mute by Pete Greig is a really good book. So there's a couple of things there. That's it for this session. There's one more talk I want to do on suffering, which looks at God's ultimate response to it. What is God's, if he's stuck with this world in which evil has crept in and suffering has become a thing, what is God's ultimate response to that? He's not happy with it. He weeps when we weep. What is God's ultimate response to suffering? That's what we're going to look at next time. Bye for now.
I fill my life with things that take my eyes off you.